Chapter 28. Freddie's. The Fredericksons' door was slightly ajar, so after she had knocked and gotten no response, Francie poked her head inside. "Miss Rickard?" she said. How should she refer to her? Mrs. Frederickson? Savory? Frederica? All these names. Francie felt like she was getting involved with a character from a Russian novel. She would have to pick a name and stick with it. Mrs. Frederickson or Miss Rickard? The latter, she decided, and Frederica, if that seemed too formal. But should she go in? Like people were casual. The door was open. If it were anybody else's place, she would go in. She stepped in. It was very quiet, also very dark. Well, it was a big house. They could be in any number of remote rooms. "Hello?" she called. "Anybody home?" Her voice echoed over the terrazzo foyer. Kitchen, she thought. I know my way to the kitchen. Francie felt her way along the dimly lit hallway and through the series of rooms she vaguely remembered stumbling into and out of with Buck the night of the party. Tonight, the rooms were devoid of guests. Here and there a lamp glowed, so at least she could see well enough to maneuver. She was almost to the kitchen when an item resting on a side table caught her eye. Was it the shape? The size or the designs? The sharp glint of silver? She turned and stared. There, on a table under a lamp, sat a small silver box, so like the one she imagined held her heart that her breath caught in her throat. It was the box, the exact box she had in her memory, which she believed to have been owned by her mother. How would it come to be here, on a side table in Frederica Rickard's house? "Pretty, isn't it?" a voice behind her said. Francie spun around. "Oh, Mrs. Frederickson, Miss Rickard." Francie scrambled to remember the name she'd decided to use, but all she could think about was that box. She wanted to turn and peek at it again, but the woman stood looking at her with her head tilted, waiting for Francie to finish. What should she say? Francie wondered. "My mother had a box like that," she blurted. "Did she?" Mrs. Frederickson said vaguely. "I remember it from when I was little," Francie continued breathlessly, talking senselessly while her mind raced. How would Mrs. Frederickson, or Miss Rickard, have gotten hold of something that belonged to her mother? But what if this woman was? No, that couldn't be. Her mother was dead. Well, that's what everyone said. But what did she have to prove that? And she'd had that feeling earlier in the evening, that feeling that her mother was somewhere, still alive. But it was lost. The box, somehow, she went on. Wouldn't it be crazy if Miss Rickard were her mother? How cool would that be? Her mother a famous stage actor? Miss Rickard didn't have black hair with a white streak, but who could tell what color her hair really was? Wow, Francie thought, it would explain her own interest in acting. Nobody else in the family was interested in theater. But wait a minute, wouldn't her own mother recognize her? Then again, maybe she didn't care. After all, she'd abandoned Francie as a baby, hadn't she? Francie realized she'd been staring at Miss Rickard without speaking for a long time. "Your door was open, and I know I'm very late. I really apologize for that. It's crazy what happened. A long story, but I just couldn't get back here any sooner. I know I was supposed to be here by 9 o'clock. Sorry." 9 o'clock, Miss Rickard mumbled vacantly. "I thought you said to stop by tonight. I hope I'm not mistaken," Francie said. The other woman's face seemed pale and drawn. "Did I?" she asked. "I'm sorry. So much on my mind lately. Would you care for a drink?" "No, thanks. I'm not really legal." "You look like you could use one," Miss Rickard said, walking into the kitchen. "I know I could." Miss Rickard continued into the pantry, and Francie heard ice being scooped from a bucket, dropped into a glass, then something being poured. The sound of ice rattling in a glass rattled something in Francie's memory, something about the party. But it was hard to think about that when faced with the tantalizing idea that her mother might be a famous actor, while also faced with the utterly depressing thought that the same mother had abandoned her. "A pleasure to see a young lady who isn't all skin and bones," Miss Rickard was saying as she re-entered the kitchen. "That's fine for television and film, but for the stage you have to be seen, don't you think? It's good to have some meat on those bones." The older woman leaned back against a counter across from Francie and stirred her drink with her finger. The clattering of ice in her glass was so insistent that Francie couldn't help but remember the detail that had been tugging at her memory. At the party, Buck's drink had ice in it. Everyone else had been drinking bottled beer or wine out of stemware. Buck had known where all the glasses were. "There in the pantry," he'd said to Buck Jr. And when Francie had asked for a tumbler, he'd found one right away, without having to comb through the acres of cupboards in the kitchen. Obviously, he was pretty familiar with the Fredrickson household. There had been some other odd things that had happened at the party, now that Francie started to think about it. Things she hadn't duly noted because she was so intent on getting near the important people. And then there'd been the distraction of the fishing incident with Buck. "Now, darlin', what can I do for you?" Miss Rickard said. Possibly for the second time, Francie had a feeling. Like, for instance, Francie thought, how Miss Rickard had known that she wasn't a landowner yet, as she'd mentioned to one of the party guests. How would she have known that if Buck hadn't told her? "I don't know, Miss Rickard," Francie said. She kind of lost track of the conversation. "Call me Freddie. All my friends do." Miss Rickard smiled her dazzling smile. "Freddie and Frenchie. We could be a vaudeville act." How did this woman know Francie's nickname was Frenchie? Well, it wasn't like it was a secret or anything. But still, why did she know all these things about her? Miss Rickard slipped a lighter out of her pocket and lit a cigarette, setting the lighter on the counter beside her. She took a drag on her cigarette, then exhaled slowly, staring at Francie through the smoke. Francie wasn't sure what to say. "Is your friend here?" she asked. "My friend? Your friend the casting director?" "Oh, yes," Miss Rickard said. "The casting director." She took a few more puffs on her cigarette, squinting at Francie through her one open eye. "I'm going to give you some advice, darling, about acting. Don't bother." "Don't bother?" Francie said, rather stupidly. "It doesn't pay." "You must have made good money, though," Francie said. "Those Broadway shows?" "Oh, sure, when I had work I made good money. But there are all those other times when you're not working and wondering, will I ever work again? Am I too old? Have I gotten too wrinkled, saggy, overweight? Will I never get another role? Or only the bit parts, the grandmothers, please God, the old housekeeper, the stern-faced schoolmistress, the old bat who cooks people into pies. Mrs. Lovett? That's a fantastic part. Anybody would want that part." "So depressing." Miss Rickard waved her hand dismissively. "The ticket is to have money. Money and opportunity to make more money. Ha ha." Francie found she couldn't look at the woman any more. Her gaze dropped to the glass in her hand. It was engraved with some fancy curly-Q letters that Francie couldn't make out, but reminded her of something. She'd seen them in some other context. But where? Miss Rickard pushed herself off the counter and strode back to the pantry. While she was gone, Francie slid her hand over the lighter. She turned it over. Yep, it was engraved too, with the same fancy initials, F.I.R. Probably for Frederica something Rickard, Francie surmised. Where had she seen those letters before? On the glass Buck had used at the party. That made sense. But somewhere else too. someplace unlikely. Miss Ricard returned, her drink refreshed, and Francie casually slipped her hands into her jacket pocket and dropped the lighter there. Maybe it was stealing, but she kinda didn't care. Francie's insides felt watery and sloshy, as if in a dream she realized why she'd had so much trouble understanding her aunt's jigsaw puzzle. It wasn't the sky exactly, it was the water. The sky reflected in a lake, or maybe the ocean. The clouds in the picture were just reflections of clouds. That's why it hadn't looked quite right. Simultaneously, she remembered where she'd seen that word, FIR, upside down on Buck's desk at Paradise Realty. An architect's drawing of buildings, condos or something, pools, tennis courts, parking lots, road, driveways. FIR, Forest Development Enterprises, Francie murmured. She looked up to see the woman staring at her. Her eyes, Francie noticed, were as black as a raven's. "Aren't you clever?" Miss Ricard said. "That's your company?" Francie asked. "In a manner of speaking," Miss Ricard answered. The heart Francie thought had been safely locked away seemed to be now lodged in her throat. "You're the one," she said, knowing she shouldn't say this, but saying it anyway. You want to develop this side of the lake, so you had to get rid of the old folks who didn't want to sell. Get them out. It wasn't Buck who was running the show." Miss Ricard guffawed. Buck. Buck was just a reflection in the ocean that was Frederica Ricard, head of the FIR Corporation, who was taking over the properties on this side of the lake in order, Francie finished her thought out loud, to turn this place into a paradise of condominiums. "Smoke and mirrors, my lovely. Smoke," Miss Ricard said, exhaling through her nose, "and mirrors." She stubbed out the cigarette in an ashtray and said, "Let's go find that friend of mine." She grabbed Francie's arm and pulled her along through the house. Francie knew she should struggle, but she had more questions. "You encouraged Buck to taint the well water, set the snakes free, do what it took to encourage the old folks to move along," Francie went on. "Well, really, did you ever think Buck could have even thought of it, much less pulled it off? Such an odd man. He was really convinced that what we wanted to do was discourage them, make them want to sell their properties. So tedious. He was a stone around my neck. So time-consuming. Just get it over with. That's my philosophy. Move on. When I stopped getting offers for roles, when my agent stopped sending me scripts, did I just sit around and mope? No, I moved on, didn't I? I moved on to greener pastures, let's say." "Was it you who set the island on fire? Shot holes in Potter's boat? Set my kayak adrift?" Miss Ricard chuckled and pushed Francie down a long hallway. "I have been busy, haven't I?" "Why, though? What do you have against me? Or Potter?" Francie struggled, but the woman's grip was like iron. Miss Ricard was tall, Francie realized, and surprisingly strong. "Mucking things up, my darling," Miss Ricard said. "In your own ways, you have just been mucking about, terrible little pigs, the both of you." She grunted like a pig, and a shiver ran down Francie's spine. Just moments ago, she had fervently been hoping she had found her mother. Now, she fervently hoped she hadn't. "Listen, sugar," Miss Ricard went on. "Let me give you the most important advice you'll ever get. You have to know your talent. That's the most important thing. Identify and use your gifts, whatever they are. Really, darling," she sighed, "it's a pity you aren't going to live long enough to find out what yours are." She opened a door to a very dark room and, without ceremony, shoved Francie inside and slammed the door.